Again, when you talk about roadblocks and vaccinations, I understand that there are some movements afoot to mandate vaccinations. But we should just think about the mechanics involved of having nurses stationed at all these roadblocks, all these vaccinations, but September has come and gone. And so another sting or another chuckle by those who don't believe. So what I'm going to share with you is a work in progress, and I want to invite you to share with me your perspective, because you might see something we're going to put on the screen here today that you don't agree with, you think it's different, and I hope that you'll share that with me. But what I've tried to lay out is not a time chart, but a sequence of events that should be helpful. I'm finding that it's helpful for me in filtering rumors and filtering things that come along either by the internet or whatever other source as to whether or not these things are reliable. So we're going to begin. There's a lot of places we could start. We could start, back. There's very important, significant events that have happened before 2009 in prophecy. But we're just going to start, for the purposes of our discussion today, with where we are right now in the fall of 2009. And I'm going to lay on the chart several waymarks here that are familiar, I think, to most everyone. And if some of this is not familiar to you, some of it will be elaborated on this morning, and some of it will not be explained in detail. So I hope that you will come and talk to me if there's something here that you're just drawing a blank and you're saying, I never heard of this before, because we could spend more time one-on-one in exploring that to help you establish that in your own mind. So it's really not my purpose to hammer out each one of these waymarks, but we're going to start by laying this out. Between now and the second coming, we know there's this National Sunday Law that we've already mentioned this morning, and then this close of probation. And so let's take a look at the events in between these major waypoints. And I want to start with this statement from the book Great Controversy, page 582, which says, "The last great conflict between truth and error is but the final struggle of the long-standing controversy concerning the law of God. Upon this battle we are now entering." Now that was written a long time ago, but it comes from a chapter, the title of which I think is very fitting for the time that we live in right now. And so I'm going to call this time period between now and the National Sunday Law the impending conflict, which is, as we're going to see here in a few moments, involves a number of increasing aspects. In Revelation chapter 18, verse 10, we read these words, "Standing afar off for the fear of her torment, saying, Alas, alas, that great city Babylon, that mighty city, for in 1 hour is thy judgment come." Many people in the world, many people who don't even know about the Bible, have heard of Babylon, and they know that Babylon plays an important part in prophecy in the last days. And there is certainly a symbolic application for Babylon in the last days, which represents all of the devil's systems in this world combined, really. And it's captured in this idea of Babylon, which in the olden days, Babylon was the city of the world. And so once again, this plays an important part. But what I want to bring out this morning is something that was new to me as I looked more closely into this. And that is that we are not only to understand the prophecies in the book of Revelation about Babylon as being symbolic or spiritual, but we are also to understand them in a literal sense. And just as Babylon was the mega city of its day, we are to understand that the prophecies about Babylon have a literal application to the cities of our day. And that in a very real sense, the cities have become the focal point in everything that happens in the world. Now, I'm not going to ask you just to rely on my word for that. I want to show you a very interesting statement that brought me to this conclusion. In Manuscript Releases, Volume 21, 91, Let all who would understand the meaning of these things read the 11th chapter of Revelation. Now, I know we were just reading from Revelation 18, but it is interesting here to note that the 11th chapter of Revelation talks about what major development in world history. We got lots of good Bible students here. I know somebody knows the answer to this question. The French Revolution. What's interesting is that there is a city that is part of this prophecy is captured in a description of a city. Anybody remember the name of that city in Revelation 11? Sodom. And that is applicable to events that happened during the French Revolution. So this is just a little background to understand what Mrs. White is saying here when she says this. Let all who would understand the meaning of these things read the 11th chapter of Revelation. Now notice, read every verse and learn the things that are yet to take place in the cities. This is a literal connection she's making. Now notice, read also the scenes portrayed in the 18th chapter of the same book. So she's telling us that the prophecies in Revelation 18, which are about Babylon, have a literal application to the cities. If you want to know what's going to take place in the cities, read those prophecies. That's pretty interesting, isn't it? And it turns out that cities are becoming central. And this has come into sharp focus for those of us living in Washington over the past few years, because you might have heard of the population density legislation that was passed in Washington State. Have you heard about that? Which gives incentives to local governments to discourage development, in other words, new homes, etc., in the rural areas, and press for more development in the metropolitan areas. And there are two very interesting things behind this. One huge movement in the world that I didn't realize just 2 or 3 years ago would go this way. But the environmental movement is pointing to the fact that it is the rural or suburban Americans that are one of the greatest contributors to greenhouse gases, because we drive around in our SUVs or whatever and put out all that exhaust. And if only everyone would press together in cities, we wouldn't have to drive so many cars, and it would be more responsible for the environment. This is a really interesting development to me that is pressing, and in Washington State now it's actually become law to give incentives to local governments to press for less development in the rural areas and more in the metropolitan areas. But of course there's a whole other thing behind this, and that is taxation, because many of the people who live in the metropolitan areas are saying, why should we have to carry the tax burden for all of those rural roads and highways and bridges that we don't use? And so money is driving this as well. Now, when you understand that in Bible prophecy, we were told long ago that the cities would become the focal point for what's going to happen at the end, then this causes a lot of other things to make sense. In the book Great Controversy, page 589, we read this about Satan. He will bring disease and disaster until populous cities are reduced to ruin and desolation. So because these are population centers, even the devil's focal point becomes the metropolitan areas in a very real way. And we see that it's going to be through two major avenues. What are they? Disease and disaster. Now notice, we're going to put up here that with all this in mind, we would expect to see an increase in disaster and disease focused on the metropolitan areas. Now, this is developed a little bit more in this statement I'm going to read to you right here, because we saw two categories, disaster and disease. But notice this, talking about disasters: storm and tempest, war and bloodshed. Now we should pause right there, because there's two kinds of disasters. What are they? Natural and man-made disasters. All right? So that's an important point, I think, to consider. In these, he, that's Satan, delights, and thus he gathers in his harvest. Now notice where this is going to take us. So completely will men be deceived by him that they will declare that these calamities are the result of the desecration of the first day of the week. You see where this moves? And this is an important point because there were, as we mentioned a little while ago, predictions that the economic difficulties that were